Look at that. We're basically twins. When I was a kid, I loved playing with Legos, and I don't make as much time for the hobby nowadays, but I still think it's a really great creative outlet. And the reason for that is I think Lego has tapped into a principle that's really important for game environment art, and it's something that we're going to get into today, and it's called modularity. The genius of Lego, in my opinion, is as you're creating, you get this feeling like you can create anything you want, yet you're limited to these pre-built Lego pieces, and in a way, isn't that kind of restricting, these rules that you have to stick to their pre-made pieces? Well, contrary to what some may think, I think it's these rules or these boundaries that actually make this creative hobby so fulfilling. With one more example, if you've ever gone to a restaurant with too many menu items, you might have experienced a phenomenon called decision paralysis. This is when you have so many options that ironically, it's actually hard to pick one. And it's more efficient for a restaurant to have a smaller menu and to limit themselves creatively to a smaller number of dishes. Not only is this easy for them to produce, but it's also easier for you as the customer to make a decision when you're not faced with just limitless possibilities. So with all of that, Legos, the restaurant, let's bring it back to this principle of modular game environments. A modular game environment is basically an environment where we've set ourselves up with these pre-made Lego brick type pieces that snap together easily to make up the entire scene. This particular environment that I'm showcasing here is a work in progress, as you could see, but it's meant to be a retail clothing environment, something that you would find in like an outlet mall. We have our main shopping space here with a men and a women's section. We have some clothing racks and displays. Back here we have the checkout counter and an employee only door that would lead back to maybe like a warehouse area with a break room and things like that. Then off to the side here, we have our changing rooms. And again, the idea here is because these pieces are made to specific dimensions, they snap together really nicely. Let me just give you some examples. But before I do, let me talk about the process and how I got to this point from the very beginning. So one thing I like to do is I like to have human scale reference in my scene whenever I'm working. These are quote unquote average sized humans, if there is such a thing as an average human. And what it is just a collection of these people in various poses. And the reason I have them in all these poses is it's supposed to give me an idea for what people would look like actually occupying this space. So for example, I'll throw one behind the counter. I might put one in a changing room just to see how it feels, if it feels too crowded in there. Also, another tool that I can use is hit Shift tilde in Blender to enter fly mode. And then if you press the tab key, you enable gravity. And that's just an easy way to walk around, again, at kind of an average human eye level, to walk around and see how you feel about the space. Another thing I'll do is typically I'll change my view settings here, my focal length in the perspective view, to something like 28 or maybe 25 millimeters. This is a lot more comfortable walking around than using something like a 50 millimeter lens. The 50 millimeter I find is just too zoomed in and doesn't feel like a human eye focal length equivalent. So I'll start with this human scale reference, but I won't start building these little modular pieces right away. Before I get to that point, I'll typically block out a rough environment. Now, the idea of a block out is basically to keep shapes as primitive as possible, not really paying any attention to modeling fine details. Everything that's green in my scene was part of my initial block outs. You can see here these security, I don't know what they call these, that are in front of the doors in retail stores. These are just cubes basically with some simple extrusions. Same thing with the display tables, the clothing racks. It's all just very, very simple shapes. And the idea here is to give me a sense for the space so that as I refine more and I start to get to specific assets that I need to create, I already know that things are going to work together well in the space and the layout is working well. So after I have this rough block out, I'll kind of spend some time thinking about dimensions with this one. So for example, this overall room, I'm not gonna have this just be some random dimensions. I'll typically try to keep this even scaled increments. So this ended up being 16.3 meters, which I don't know why that's a little bit off. I think I scaled it initially to be 16 meters even. And the reason for that is if I use these even whole meter numbers, then it becomes a lot easier when I actually get around to creating my modular wall sections. And modular walls are usually what I'll start with. So I'll create a plane, for instance. This doesn't start as a solid wall, it's just a plane. And this plane, if we go to our item settings here, you could see it's 4 meters tall by 2 meters wide. And the reason I chose 2 meters is so that I could easily fill in that 16 meter space. So I really only have maybe 2 or 3 wall variations that I can show you right now. I have our main wall section, that's that 2 by 4 meter section. I have one variation that has an opening for a doorway. And by the way, each of these will have some trim at the bottom there. This will eventually all be part of one modular asset. And that will be one piece. This section with the trim will be another piece. So that one right there. So I have one section of wall with a door. Then I have a corner section, and this is 1 meter in each direction. You can see the length of those edges right there. And this wall section actually works for both the concave and the convex corners of the store. So this is an example of a concave one, and this is a convex, so it's just rotated 90 degrees, or I guess 180 degrees to fill up the outside wall. And that's pretty much it. I have a wall, I have a variation with a door hole, and then I have a corner that works for both an inside and an outside corner. The only other wall piece I ended up with, just to make things work out, is this one piece here that houses the double doors. So this double door is just double, go figure, the size of my single door over here. And so yeah, this makes up the last wall piece. Now, within those wall pieces, I will end up with some variations. The only big variation that I'm gonna have here is most of the walls will be this kind of solid, just basically flat planes with a solidify modifier. And then these specific walls that are blue up front, these will eventually be windows, just because I need something for my little display area here. So as you can see, I started with this block out, and then I start filling in with actual modular pieces. And it's important to note, I'm only laying out my scene here in Blender to make sure that it actually works. But when it comes time to make my final assets, I really only need to make one version of this wall. So I would join these together, and I would then start to texture this. Some important notes here is it does matter where our origin is. So to change the origin on an object, you could just hit Control period in object mode. Then I'll snap it back to this back corner and hit Control period again to clear it. The reason we have our object origins at the bottom and at a corner is it's just gonna make snapping in Unreal a little bit easier. In Unreal Engine, when we get there, we'll basically have the equivalent of this grid snapping. So when we duplicate a wall section, it'll just be snapped in these even grids, and we can continue this wall going as long as we want. So that's one consideration, is I'm really only making all of these sections in Blender because I wanna make sure it works for the actual layout. But when I get to actually exporting for Unreal, I'm just gonna export one single section that'll go into Unreal, and then I can actually lay things out again in Unreal. Another important thing to mention about the walls is I do have wall thickness. Now the reason for this is basically twofold. Number one, it helps stop light bleeding, especially if you're using like Lumen in Unreal Engine, you might get some issues with light bleeding. So I like to have some thickness. The second reason is it makes having things like doorways just a whole lot easier. As you walk through this doorway, you have an opposite side that can also have some textures. If you're really worried about conserving UV space, you could actually just go ahead and delete these faces. Those aren't technically necessary. You still have your double-sided wall, and we could have trim on both sides, but you're never really gonna see those thickness faces. So feel free to delete those if you want. I'm not gonna worry about that too much. The last thing to talk about here is texturing. Now, I haven't gone through texturing yet for this, but I can still talk about my general approach. Basically, there's two approaches to texturing. Number one is where we have baked textures. This is gonna be for my eventual mannequins. Now, these are just placeholder for now, but when I create mannequins, they're not just gonna have one tiling texture. I wanna have more details like edge maps and cavity details and all sorts of stuff. So for that, I would have each object would have its own UV space, and I would bake the textures onto it. Another option for that, or another example of that, would be something like this shelf. This is something I would probably use baked textures for. Things like the clothing rack, anything that's pretty self-contained as a single object. Now, that's not the only option for texturing. I can also use a tiled approach, and that is something I would do for things like the walls and the flooring. The floor, as you can see, is just a 2 by 2 meter section, and I would basically, when I bring it into Unreal, I would tile that to fill up the whole space. And that 2 by 2 measurement is a general basis for my whole scene, and that's what most of these modular pieces end up being measured out to, like the counters and the floor. But that's beside the point. With the actual tiling, I would have to make that work for the way the texture repeats. Now, that's really easy for something like the floor piece because it's a total even square, so it's really easy to set up that tiling. It's a little bit more complicated for something like this wall section. Because this is 2 by 4, it's not square. So if I bring up this example here, you can see how I've managed to pull this off. Now, this side of the texture atlas, the wall brick texture, lines up seamlessly with this side. So I know when I get to the end of this wall, I'm repeating and I can start over with the next one. And that's the case not just for this wall section, but for everything that has this brick texture. If I go to my material preview, you can see that things line up nice and seamlessly regardless of which wall I'm using. And the reason I have this second half here is basically just a different variation. I could use that second half on something like the outside reverse walls, which I don't have set up now, but let me just show you an example of that. Let me grab each of these, go into edit mode, grab all of our UVs and snap them over here. And now I also have this tiling pattern for a different wall variation. Now it's worth mentioning, this isn't the best tiling pattern because I have this really noticeable area right here, and it's really easy to see how that repeats in the scene. But I just wanted to show you how you could use one square image, even though we're only utilizing half of it, to have some variation for our walls. And again, it's much easier for something like a square image texture. Because most textures come in a square aspect ratio, it just makes it really simple when we end up tiling that in our scene. Yeah, things line up pretty seamlessly. Now, I know it's tough to picture a finished game environment just from this messy work in progress here, but I wanted to show you the early stages because that's when all of the planning happens and things just start to come together. What you're seeing now is a separate environment I did, but with all of these same examples. Obviously, this one is further along and actually brought into Unreal with some lighting and more props, but the bones, or the structure, is the same. I have modular wall sections, corners, modular staircase, doors, floors, ceiling, all of the stuff we have in our other example. From that, in Unreal, I can quickly piece together this whole environment. Anyway, I just wanted you to see an example of how this super simple technique can actually start to come together. For now, let's go back to the work in progress environment. So that's the basics of our modular environment. Keep in mind, this isn't a finished environment, obviously. I just wanted to jump in and show you at this point how I would go about doing the initial setup. I start with a block out, not worrying about, modeling anything specifically. These racks, for example, this is just a very, very rough block out. And then the final result, the goal with all of this is, if you take a look here, is I condense this down to a single list. So as you can see, I have a 4x2 wall section, and then I know I need a variation with a door opening, and I need a variation that is a glass panel wall. I won't go through my whole list, but you can read it if you want to. The idea is, now that I've gone through the work of laying stuff out, blocking it out in Blender, then building out some of the modular pieces, at least to their proper measurements, now I have a very, very detailed list of every single prop I would need to make for this environment, as well as the specific measurements. Now this is just the modular, or these are just the modular pieces of the environment. Keep in mind, the environment on top of this would need some set dressing, so little clothing piles, hangers hanging from the racks, cash register, computer, things like that. Whatever's gonna be laying around the store. But these are at least all of the big modular chunks. So yeah, this has really just been a process video to show you, or not a process, but really a method video to show you the method behind creating something like this. And although I haven't taken you all the way through the process, I hope you've gotten a good view and a good look at what this would actually be like in your own production. Feel free, if you want to, leave questions down below. As I continue to work on this scene, I'll post some update videos as I come across other things that are worth learning about. Of course, go check out my Patreon. It's patreon.com/RileyB3D. I really, really appreciate the support. This kind of content, this long form, educational, obviously it's not very exciting or entertaining for the masses, and that's intentional. I want it to be something you can actually get good value from and learn from, and that comes at a bit of a cost because I spend less time making it this high production that's really just about entertainment, because I want to get you the information in a clean and efficient way. So with all that said, I need your support, because really YouTube is not a source of income when it comes to like YouTube views. This kind of video just does not perform very well. And again, I do that intentionally. I do that knowing that hopefully I can get some of you to sign up to the Patreon, where we have more exclusive content and more in-depth tutorials and asset packs that you can download for free once you're a Patreon supporter. In addition to that, we have a private Patreon Discord server where you can go and you can ask me questions directly as you're having problems with your scenes. I'm known for getting on there and not just answering your questions, but even recording personalized video tutorials where I walk you through your scene and all of the improvements that I would make if I was working on it. So again, hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully it's motivating and exciting for you to go start working on your own modular environment. Please, please leave questions if you have them. Make sure you comment, subscribe, and again, go check out my Patreon. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.